thank you all for coming here on a hot day. I hope our fans are helping you out. It is getting a little cooler outside. If you're all here, journalist Russ Baker. Russ is a long-time investigative journalist whose work has appeared in many leading publications. Among his most notable stories are an examination of George W. Bush's National Guard record, the misleading New York Times stories about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, media indifference to the capturing of the Serbian war criminal Radovan Karadzic, and the practices of Scientology. Baker is also founder and editor-in-chief of the online website WhoWhatWhy, which he says practices forensic journalism that probes deep politics and the secret nexus of power and money, which mainstream media often does not reveal. There's also another side to Russ Baker. His controversial book, Family of Secrets, published in 2008, contends that the elder President Bush was at the center of a plot to assassinate President John F. Kennedy that included his father Prescott Bush, then Vice President Lyndon Johnson, CIA Director Allen Dulles, Cuban and Russian exiles, and some Texas oilmen. Baker also claims that Washington Post reporter Bob Woodward was an intelligence operative who conspired with John Dean to remove President Richard Nixon for opposing the oil depletion allowance. Russ Baker will discuss the problems of both fake news and those of the conventional media that he feels often fails to dig deep enough. Russ Baker.
Thank you. I didn't expect you all to be hit with something quite that hard, and I know you're all rushing for the exits. In fairness, I want to say that sounds like something that's on Wikipedia, which has been under constant attack by mysterious anonymous people who keep rewriting anything that's on there. So that's something that I've had to contend with, and a lot of my friends who are very, very successful journalists who dared stray away from any of the orthodoxy immediately found themselves under similar sorts of contextualizations, if you want to call it that. The theme of my talk today is fake news, and it's what is fake news and what is real news. And I want to start by saying that I forgot to bring my t-shirt I wanted to wear, and it says, "Enemy of the People." And does anybody remember who recently recoined that classic literary expression?
I think so.
Who was it? It was Donald Trump. And as you know, we in the media have been under attack relentlessly from all quarters. It's nothing new to me because I've been under attack about the last 15 years or so when I strayed from doing the exact same stories that I was told to do and that I did for the New York Times and Vanity Fair and Esquire and everything else. And I began asking questions about things that just didn't make any sense. And my editors told me, "You really shouldn't go there. This is not good for you and it's not good for us." To which I replied, "Well, it appears to be true and I've got all the documents." To which they replied, "That doesn't matter." Of course, I'm not an enemy of the people. In fact, I represent the public, essentially delegated to investigate things and report back with no fear and no favor and no preconceptions of what I will find. And I want to emphasize that those references of what's in my book, and John, if you want to just pass the book around so people can take a look at it. Gore Vidal thought it was one of the most important books of the previous decade, Dan Rather and Bill Moyers. So if what I have to say is ridiculous, then so does what they have to say. But it is unfamiliar, and the reason it's unfamiliar is because we operate, unfortunately, in a frame where almost everything we know comes from a handful of declared prestige publications and TV shows, and we all watch, and it's all we hear about, and the books we read are on the bestseller list, and we really know, actually, very, very little about much of anything, including myself, by the way. And I just want to mention here my good friend Jonathan Larson, who's sitting in the front row. He lives here in Vermont. If you don't know John, I consider John probably the greatest living investigative editor. He was the editor of The Village Voice back in its heyday, when, as a scrappy paper based in New York City, it broke, I would say, more important national and international stories than the much larger, better funded, more famous brands. And John was, I'm very proud to be his friend. He's supported my work for decades, always never doing anything except saying, how do you know? Let's see the stuff. And if it seemed to be right, he said, let's go for it. And there are very, very few people. I consider him to be an American hero. Okay, so I want to start with this fake news business. Basically, I want to read something I read on CNN. It's a description of the day that Mueller's hearing took place. By the way, we have a technical stop at 4:40, but I was told because we're the last session of the day, and I usually find that these things, people get pretty interested in them, start having a good dialogue. So they told us that we could go as long as we want, so, okay. It says, Trump looked like a fighter. Sorry, I'm going to get my glasses. Trump looked like a fighter when he was seen pacing back and forth and fielding questions from the press. He repeatedly said, "You're fake news, you're fake news, you're fake news." And he called the questioner one of the worst. 1 hour later, Nancy Pelosi spoke like a friend when she was wrapping up a press conference. Quote, "President Lincoln said, public sentiment is everything. Well, in order for the public to have the sentiment, the public has to know. So I hope you will be the messengers of the truth to the public. We think today was really a milestone in making that sentiment more informed." Obviously, two very different feelings. We're encountering some tremendous societal angst these days. I think we'd all agree. And so I'll give you an example. You may have heard of these congresswomen who are being referred to as the squad, and Trump is going after them. And this is from Snopes. How many of you know what Snopes is? This is a website that purports to determine what is real and what isn't, which of course is highly subjective, but they're right more than they're wrong. And they said, did Rashida Tlaib, I'm going to pronounce her name wrong, celebrate the Holocaust, say it gave her a, quote, warm feeling? You know, right away you have to think, my God, would anybody really say that? Seems unlikely, certainly for somebody who's in elective office and wants to stay there. And then it says, right-leaning websites, this is from Snopes, grossly distorted the nuanced reflections of the Michigan congressman on what had happened in Palestine after World War II. And apparently she said that she recognized that she felt her people had been displaced, but she also recognized it was complex and that there were Jews fleeing mass murder in the Holocaust, and it gave her a warm feeling that at least they found a place to be safe. So this is a little bit different than having a warm feeling about the Holocaust. This is one of the problems we have in this country, and then in any case, President Donald Trump described her remarks as, quote, horrible and highly insensitive, and falsely claimed that, quote, she obviously has tremendous hatred of Israel and the Jewish people. And Representative Steve Scalise, Republican of Louisiana, called Tlaib's remarks, quote, twisted and disgusting, and said they were heinous anti-Semitic comments. U.S. Rep. Liz Cheney, you remember that surname, Liz Cheney, Republican of Wyoming, cited Tlaib's remarks as an example of the evil of anti-Semitism. So the U.S. is more divided than ever. I think it is in my lifetime and probably in your lifetimes. We really, thanks to a variety of factors, we have a rift that has not existed in decades. The country is essentially at war with itself. That is what we're dealing with. Here's a quote, lying to the public used to hurt presidents. This is from some expert, and then he says, well, it has hurt Trump too. He's never been able to crack 50% in reliable approval rating polls, and about 2/3 of voters describe him as dishonest, which means even some of his supporters know that he's deceitful, and they accept it. Now, this gets a little bit more complicated, because it really isn't just about that some people are telling the truth and some people are lying. There certainly is some of that. But the fact of the matter is, you probably heard this expression, greater truth. And this really comes down to how you see things, how you experience things. And whatever our beliefs may be, we may think that the rights of immigrants are important, that immigration is a healthy process, that we need immigrants in this country to sustain the economy. That is our opinion, and that is our perception. But it is also the right of people who are worried that the country can't sustain more population growth. They feel rightly or wrongly, that they're losing jobs to these other people. They feel that there are supposed to be certain hoops that people have to jump through to come to the country, and they're very mad, and I think they're mad at the media, which they see as knee-jerk liberal, to not even consider that viewpoint. And I might say that I have a lot of liberal friends who privately will say that they recognize that the immigration issue is actually more complicated. And so there are many, many issues like that. Someone like another member of the squad, Ilhan Omar, she is a Somalian refugee who wears a headscarf. Now, obviously, to some, they perceive her to have a big mouth, and they say, what is this woman who looks different and has a headscarf having such a big mouth? She wasn't even born in this country. Nobody made her come here. And of course, that again is very, very subjective. Our country, our values. I was just thinking, last time I got on a plane, do you notice when you get on a plane, who gets to board first? Yell it out. Well, rich people and the military. Okay, now let's think about this. How many other countries have you been in where the military gets to board first? I mean, it's an interesting thought, right? I'm not trying to disrespect the military. My father fought in World War II. Obviously, the military has done some great things, but to just sort of blanket, the military gets on first. I mean, I also think journalists should, maybe get on first. We all probably think somebody else should get on first. How about school teachers? How about social workers, right? How about home health aides? I mean, they don't get any appreciation. Look at the amazing contribution that they make. And so, these things are complicated. When the soldier gets on the plane, where did that person serve? Did they serve in Somalia, where Ilhan Omar came from? And by the way, why were they there? What was that about? What is Somalia? Where is it? What is that about? My friend John Larson was just bemoaning the other day the history of the destruction of geography departments in universities. They stopped teaching it. John has a fascinating story about at Harvard where this is his story, so don't hold me to this, but he says that there were two professors early in the 20th century who were top geography professors, and it was discovered, woe is me, that they were gay and that they were lovers, and this so scandalized Harvard that they got rid of them and shut down the geography department. Oh, no. And then all the other schools started saying, well, Harvard doesn't have a geography department, why should we have one? Now, we'll have to look that up and go to Snopes, but it's a pretty good story. So anyway, what was that war all about? I mean, how many people know why people in Somalia have to become pirates? It's right there, it's sticking out in those shipping lanes. And what comes through those shipping lanes? Oil. Hello? I mean, what do we care about more than almost anything, right? Gassing up the car and going where we go, or being able to get on the plane. We're just mad if we sit on the tarmac for 10 extra minutes. We don't think about any of this stuff. And this is, I guess, where I'm going with this talk, which is that it's complicated. And although I am, I suppose one of those bleeding heart liberals that Fox and everybody hates, I also recognize that it's complicated, and I want to have a dialogue. I do think that Fox and Trump and these folks are able to allege media bias by grabbing onto things that actually do have a sliver of basis. Their appeal and their supporters are responding only to very basic things. I mean, honestly, some of you probably like Fox, but not a lot of people who watch Fox are probably coming to a book festival. I don't know, maybe that's unfair. Actually, let's do a survey here, and again, please don't hold this against anybody. How many of you get most of your news from CNN? Nobody. 1, 2? All over. Okay, MSNBC? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Fox. And be honest, it's okay. It's a very entertaining thing. There's got to be somebody in the room. Nobody will pillory you. Oh, come on, really nobody in the whole room? Okay, there's my point. Okay, they're not coming to book festivals. All right. How about out of country?
News from other countries.
Oh, news, BBC. Who watches BBC? 1, 2, 3, 4. Wow, it's like 7, 8, 9. Oh my God, that's the leading one. Isn't that interesting? You have to go out of the country to find out what's happening here. NPR, okay. NPR, oh, this is an NPR crowd, okay. All right, wait till I tell you about NPR wouldn't have me on to talk about my book. What? Print, okay. How many of you read the New York Times regularly? Oh, wow, there you go, okay. Home delivery? Wow. Washington Post, okay. You heard what he said, what I said about Bob Woodward. All right, it's all in the book. John's passing the book around. They will have copies downstairs. Everything in there is footnoted. There's about 1,100 footnotes in there. You can read about Bob Woodward secretly serving in naval intelligence right before he mysteriously got a job at the Washington Post and was put right into the Watergate thing. Very, very interesting stuff, which I didn't know about before I started doing my research. I thought that Nixon was the villain. I thought that Oswald shot Kennedy, like all of you do, right? Because we only know what we know. We only know what we're told, unless the media does its job and fearlessly looks into things. Now, we have a lot of hot button issues, don't we, that divide us. Always, abortion is always an issue, right? Race, tremendous issue right now in this country, maybe the issue. Taxes. Everybody's interested in taxes. Republicans are better than the Democrats. They basically say, unlike the Democrats, we will protect you and your family from crazy and deviant people, and we will also give you your money back. Hey, that's a pretty good appeal. And this is one of the reasons that even though statistically the Republicans are a smaller minority, they win a lot because they focus on those basic things. So we have that. We have American exceptionalism, the idea, we'll talk about this, the idea that America is essentially a great and good country, that we are fundamentally good people, unlike Germans, French people, people from the Netherlands or Greece or Guatemala. We are fundamentally good people, and therefore what we do in this country is always fundamentally good, even if we made some mistakes. And as I will say, that is the policy of the media, including the liberal media. Okay. Some are for Trump because of their pocketbook, but of course the tax cuts went to the corporations, buying back their own stock, which is a maneuver to increase the amount of money in their pockets. And although official unemployment is low, more people than ever are struggling. More people hold 3 jobs. And I'm not an expert on this, but I'm told by WhoWhatWhy, the site I run, our economics guy, used to work at the Wall Street Journal. He says that it's just most people have completely given up. They're not counted. And somehow, if there are 3 jobs that are filled, they're counted as 3 jobs that are filled, even if they're filled by the same person. Okay, don't hold me to that. Again, I have not researched that. Okay, so how well are politicians or the media really doing in giving us non-fake news? Non-fake news as opposed to fake news, or maybe we call it real news. Okay, so first of all, we have the Trump and Fox and so on, and they really, they don't totally make everything up, but they kind of make up a lot of it. So like, if you were actually somewhere, they would say you were there, but then they would say that was proof of something, but it actually wasn't. Okay, and this is very important for me as an investigative reporter because I'm dealing with a proof of people doing things, documents and so on, you have to put together, and then we have to discuss, is this all a coincidence, or how many coincidences begin to equate a pattern, which is, as every good prosecutor knows, when you're trying to make a conspiracy case right away, they call them conspiracy nuts unless you're a prosecutor, in which case that's your job to document conspiracies and send people to jail for them, and have a theory around them, which makes them, I guess, conspiracy theorists. Okay. So I would say that neither the liberal media nor the Trump base really show any interest in digging deep on what ails America, what really ails America. And this is why I believe there needs to be a third way, not Fox, not the New York Times, but a third way. And if we have time, I can tell you some stories, and I've written for the New York Times. I have friends who work there. I have friends who left there. If you know anybody like Chris Hedges, I mean, virulent critiques of the place they used to work at for what they weren't able to do and the analysis they weren't able to provide. And of course, you've heard that term deep state. How many of you have heard that term, deep state? How many of you think it's a term when you hear it used that you feel positively toward the person who uses it? Nobody. Okay, so this is very interesting. These terms are pejoratized, and they're weaponized. They are made to trigger things in your brain so that you feel disposed toward a certain person. And so if my friend here reads something on Wikipedia that was written by somebody who's out to harm me, and he sees certain words, and I'm not blaming you, but they triggered in his mind, I'm guessing, some dislike for me, not having never met each other, perfectly lovely guy. But he's already thinking, I don't like this guy, and I don't trust this guy, and here I am stuck having to introduce him. I'm so sorry for that. But, this is the problem with this stuff. They're triggers, and I can tell you where they come from. They come from the man who created modern public relations. Does anybody know about him? What's his name? Bernays, Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays worked for the ruling classes of America, and they said to him, we have a problem, we're only a few people, we got a lot, big estates here in South Woodstock and so forth, and then there's all the hoi polloi, and they're all starving with their pitchforks, what are we going to do? Well, you got two choices, right? You use a gun, or you can use a carrot. And so the idea was, how do we talk to people, and how do we lull them? So there were things, entertainment, things, with all due respect to a church, religion, sports, celebrity gossip, fascination with thrillers and mysteries. And I love all these things, but I'm just saying I'm aware of what's going on, which is we only have so much time for anything, right? I heard a woman, she was at an earlier thing, and then she said, I'm going to go home and make the string beans and then come back for 4 o'clock. You know, she's got to make the string beans. So we only have so much time, and we have to make our decisions. Do we come here, Russ Baker? Do we go listen to the poet? Do we listen to my friend Ed Koren talking about his cartoons, wonderful cartoons in the New Yorker? We have to make choices, and we tend to choose the ice cream, the stuff that tastes good. Yeah, we got a hard life, you know, it's hard, we're tired. We really don't want to hear this guy, you know, doom and gloom, you know. So they know this, and this is what fills up our bandwidth. And then the prestige media that I used to work for, and John was the Time Magazine bureau chief in Saigon during Vietnam. John and I and all these other people discovered that, you know, to some extent, we were providing a certain narrative. And by the way, news is, to my mind, largely entertainment. It's conflict. It's conflict, and conflict always sells, right? War, crime, whodunits, you know, the Trump-Russia thing as an element of that, Mueller, who did what, you know. As soon as somebody starts talking about infrastructure, like our roads, school buses, you know, right? People just tune out because it's kind of boring. Nobody wants to hear about it, but it's actually the stuff that affects us. So this term deep state is an interesting one because originally it was not pejorative until the people who spin this stuff got to it. The original term, the deep state, came from Turkey. And in Turkey, if you go to Turkey, the academics there all teach, at all the great universities, they all teach about the deep state. And the deep state simply is elements within the establishment, including the government, who have a common viewpoint about what's good for themselves and their class and ostensibly the country, and they kind of know each other. They went to the same schools, some intermarriage and so on. We had the same thing in this country. I write about that in my book, Family of Secrets. This is about this class of people who all went to Yale and Princeton and Harvard and so on, and they all knew each other. They served in the military. Many of them were in military intelligence in World War II. They were in the OSS. They went into the new CIA, and some of them were recruited right out of Yale, where there were professors. And we know all their names. There's books about all this. Don't take my word for it. And these people were these professors whose jobs were to recruit the best and the brightest, the students, and route them. And I've talked to many people who told me they were recruited through this process, routed into the intelligence agencies. And back then, the CIA and so on was a very elite cadre, not so much today. So the term deep state is sort of opportunistically cannibalizing and distorting an important notion and preventing us from thinking. Because wealth and connections badly distort democracy and encourage policies carried out in secret, which is fundamentally anti-democratic. And here in Vermont, where we celebrate the small town, right, democracy, the town meeting, everybody can come and everyone can participate, we should be especially sensitive to whether we're losing democracy in this country and whether the media and this whole discussion helps us regain or not regain that fragile democracy. So let's talk about, who's ever heard of Jeffrey Epstein? Okay, how many people, how many here had heard of him 3 years ago? 1, 2, 3, raise your hands high, I want to see. Okay, about a quarter of you, all right. Here's the thing about Jeffrey Epstein. I heard about Jeffrey Epstein about 15 years ago or 20 years ago, and people were telling me stuff, and they were like, this guy is whacked, seriously, and he's got friends. He's friends with Bill Clinton, he's friends with Prince Andrew, he's friends with the TV lawyer Alan Dershowitz. All of these people are his friends, and he's a really creepy monster. But nobody wanted to publish this. Why? Because it's scary. Litigious people, who knows? Journalists fundamentally, and I just want to say this, New York Times and New Yorker and so on, they all, in theory, wanted to do Me Too 20 years ago, but they couldn't because the consensus was this is not what you do. And this is what I'm getting at. What I'm doing now when I broke away from the media is what they told me, this is not what we do now. This is not how we do it. You wait until the pack forms, put your finger in the air, see which way the wind's blowing, and it's safe, and we all turn, and then each publication, each TV show has the exact same story. Have you noticed this? Flip the channels, it's all the same. And the reason it's all the same is they don't know anything original. They don't want to break away from it, and the bosses are nervous about this stuff. And this is where Fox and Trump start to make a case, is it's this, you know, amen chorus. It's everybody kind of the same thing. None of them really understand Russiagate. John and I are working on a story for our site, WhoWhatWhy, trying to actually figure out honestly, what the heck is this Russiagate thing about? What were all those meetings in Trump Tower, you know? I mean, what really was going on? What is any of this about? Is Trump the Manchurian candidate or not? You know, we're trying to honestly figure it out, and we're not in favor of any outcome at all. We just want to know. But we didn't get that after all of that blather. We don't know. It's really, I myself, when people ask me what anything is about, I say, I don't know. It's really confusing. And when you read the articles, the New York Times and stuff, you know what? They don't understand it either. They only understand just enough to put together a reasonably coherent article with the help of editors. That's what they're working with. Okay, so I wrote a book called Family of Secrets. Let's see how we're doing time-wise. 4:26. We're going to go to questions pretty soon because I'm sure you have some. I wrote a book called Family of Secrets. The reason I wrote the book was, can you hear me okay? All right. I wrote a book called The Family of Secrets. The reason I wrote it was I was living in the Balkans, in the former Yugoslavia in the early 2000s. The State Department paid me, paid me to go there and teach journalists how to do investigative journalism because that's democracy building, soft power. So I went there, was there for a few weeks. I stayed and stayed and stayed. I ended up, after that gig was over, I freelanced and I wrote for the Christian Science Monitor and, you know, the Guardian. I don't remember all these places I wrote for, but anyway, they were finding mass graves, this huge war that nobody even remembers anymore, where 200,000 people were slaughtered by hand by mostly their neighbors. I mean, this is within our lifetime. People who are not that old, you know, went through that. We don't even remember that anymore. I talked to millennials and they never heard of it. And they never heard of Watergate either, by the way. I mean, what we're dealing with. So I was being attacked everywhere I went as an American because, anybody remember what happened in the early 2000s that would turn people against America? The Iraq War. And I literally went to get a ticket at a train station in Belgium, and I went to get a ticket, and he heard my accent. He said, "You American?" I said, "Yes," and he spat at me. Okay, so I thought, we have a real problem here in this country, and I'm getting blamed for this stuff, and I don't support it. I don't understand why they went in there. At the time, I'd actually written that they didn't have a basis to do it. I couldn't get it published. New York Times, all of them, nobody would publish it. And as you may know, the New York Times, which I like, by the way, I think it's a pretty good paper, but you know, they were the leading cheerleader for a false narrative. Remember Judith Miller? And I wrote one of the first articles, a cover story in The Nation magazine, telling everybody why you couldn't trust this story. Okay, I don't get any awards or any credit, and most of the mainstream media actually begrudge me for that as a troublemaker. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with. So anyway, I decided to start this book, and I decided to look at the Bush family and say, how did this family become president of the United States? And not one of them, but two of them with the same name. Two George Bushes. Isn't that interesting? We had John Adams and John Quincy Adams, but we had two George Bushes became president, vice president. In a period of 24 years, 20 of those years had a Bush in power, which is astonishing. It's never happened. And I said, you know, whatever you want to make, these are not like the greatest shakes in the barrel. You know, even the father, remember, threw up in the Japanese prime minister, said he couldn't remember, you know, what was the thing they asked him, and he had trouble defining like what he believed in. That was tough for him. So, you know, this is what we're dealing with. And the son, I mean, my gosh. So I started working on this thing, and I was like, this is Looney Tunes, you know? And the media is not really, like, I think they didn't really get it with Trump. And they don't even know how to cover that, because when it gets super crazy, I mean, imagine being a reporter in Germany in the 30s. How do you cover this kind of thing? There's no context. And then people accuse you of being biased, so you have to say, well, Mr. Hitler denied it. You know, I mean, it's very, very hard. So anyway, I began working on these stories, And I discovered all these falsehoods from the Bush family, and I found one after another, and I became interested in the father, and I started trying to figure out how the father had gotten to the top. And I asked people, I literally went to people I know at these major journalism things, and I said, well, how did George H.W. Bush become president? And he said, well, it's easy. I said, oh, what was that? Well, he was vice president. So I said, oh, okay, well, how did he become vice president? He said, well, I don't know. Well, he was CIA director. So I said, oh, how many CIA directors became vice president? Answer, 0. So I said, well, that's not some precedent. And then I said, hey, how did he become CIA director? Now nobody had an answer. And I went to look it up. And the New York Times, when he became CIA director, basically said something like, he seems to be a kind of a nice guy, good looking. CIA's in trouble. There were all these hearings investigating, for the first time revealing that the CIA was going around overthrowing and murdering democratically elected leaders. And this was all documented in the Frank Church and other Senate and House hearings. And they were admitting to this stuff. And that's what happened when George H.W. Bush, of all the people, was chosen to take over the CIA. So I said, I better learn more about him. I started digging into him, and then I read in another book by a best-selling author that George H.W. Bush had once been interviewed and had been asked, oh, you've had such an interesting life, Mr. President. What was it like? What do you remember the day John F. Kennedy was shot? Where were you? What was your reaction? And he froze. He went white. He didn't know what to say, and he said, I was somewhere in Texas. I can't remember. Now, I always ask audiences, how many of you were over the age of 5 in 1963? Please raise your hand. Okay. How many of you who are over the age of 5 cannot remember where you were on November 22, 1963 when you heard? Oh, come on, there must be one. Let's support our president here. Nobody. Well, that's interesting. So anyway, I thought, well, that's interesting. I'm a journalist. I'm interested in the Bush family. I'm going to find out where he was. And I spent years, and John Larson went with me to Texas, and we looked under every rock, and we looked at every oil drilling record. We spent 5 years going through thousands of documents, and we found out where he was. And I will give you one guess where George H.W. Bush was on that day. He was in Dallas, and I have it in the book, a picture of a thing from the night before that he's speaking to the Oil Drillers Association at this hotel about a half a block from where Kennedy was shot. Okay? Now, he was doing that at night. Where do you suppose he was the next morning, in all probability? He was either there or he had hightailed it out of town. We only know where he was in the early afternoon when he left he flew in a private plane to another town in the afternoon after Kennedy was shot, went to a phone and called the FBI. This is from FBI documents. It says, Mr. George Bush, 3224 Briar, Houston, an oilman, called us to report that he, are you ready, may know who shot the president. Okay, how many of you called the FBI to say you knew who shot the president? Okay, do you see where I'm going with this? I thought that was interesting. What did he know that nobody else knew? And in fact, it turned out, and I have a whole chapter in Family of Secrets about this extraordinary story. It turns out, because we interviewed all these people, he didn't know who shot the president. He was hanging out to dry a guy he knew really well, who he knew had nothing to do with it. And then you say, well, why is he doing this? Why is he calling the FBI, getting his name in the records? Well, we found out why, because there was another memo that J. Edgar Hoover wrote that was, unfortunately for Bush, was released through the JFK Records Act when Oliver Stone's movie came out, and Congress voted unanimously, even though they all the reporters are looking at this nuts, they all voted to release all of this after the movie came out. So what was that document? The document was from J. Edgar Hoover, and it said, we provided a briefing, it said, assassination of President John F. Kennedy, to 2 people from other agencies, Mr. So-and-so of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and Mr. George Bush of the CIA. Date 1963. George Bush, CIA director, 1976, 13 years later, according to the New York Times, a man who had no experience, knowledge, or background in intelligence, who was only taken because he was a good-looking, pleasant guy who was liked. Okay? Anyway, we don't have time to go into all this. What I'm getting at is there's a lot of stuff we don't know anything about. Most of the stuff we don't know anything about. Journalists don't know anything about it. Congressmen don't know anything about it. I actually had a U.S. Senator contacted me, and he said, I'm coming to New York, and I'd like to meet you for coffee. And I said, oh, okay, any reason? He said, well, I heard your book is a must-read, and I've been told that by a number of people. And I said, okay. I said, and we met, and I said, well, why don't you use the book? He said, well, I don't have time to read a book. And this is one of the more cerebral ones, okay? And if I told you his name, you like him. He's a good guy. And he said, well, I don't have time to read a book. I said, give it to your chief of staff. He said, you know what? What's he going to say? He doesn't have time to read a book either. Okay, this is what we're dealing with. And then they are the ones in the hearings asking the questions. They know less than I do, and I don't know very much. So the bottom line is, I want to quote Vincent Bugliosi, the noted defender of the Warren Commission, whom I knew, and I met him at a party after his giant book, and he got on every TV show, and he said to me, oh, I heard your book, I should read your book, and what do you think of my book? And I said, well, you don't know what you're talking about. And he said, well, what do you mean? And I started reeling off things. John just gave me one that, did you know that the bullet that went into Kennedy's whatever back, supposedly, was actually 3 or 4 inches below what the Warren Commission said, and that Gerald Ford changed it? Is that right, John? Yeah. Changed it so to explain the magic bullet theory, because if it went in where all the doctors said it went in, there was an extra shot, which they had timed it, and with that gun and everything, this man, Lee Harvey Oswald, who according to the military records was one of the worst shooters in his unit, they used to joke about what a bad shooter he was. He had a bent scope, he had a ridiculous old rifle. The experts could not get those shots off in time. Anyway, you got to look at this stuff objectively and not be influenced by the fact that when my book came out, and I was published by Bloomsbury. How many of you heard of Bloomsbury, a publisher? Okay, a lot of you are nodding. They also published, you never heard of this, it's called Harry Potter. Now, of course, my book is much more successful. Thank you very much. But my point is, they published my book, they had the guts, but guess what? They were British. I have all these letters from major American publishers, all the big brands, and they all said, this book is tremendous, magisterial, sorry, can't publish it, too hot. One said, I only wish I had the blanks to publish this. Okay, rhymes with cojones. Anyway, the thing is, they all said, God, this is great stuff. I wish, my publisher begged me, please take the Kennedy and the Watergate stuff out. This is going to cause cognitive dissonance because nobody's heard this. It sounds crazy. I said, do you think it's crazy? He said, I do not. You have persuaded me, but it's too big for me to handle. And we were invited when the book first came out. The New York Times read the review, read the summary, and she said, I want to publish the first exclusive, this sounds amazing, thing. It never came out. Time magazine told me they loved it. The book critics said, I've convinced Time to give Russ a guest column. It's going to be a huge thing. You're going to have like several pages. When it came out, it was the Barack Obama Man of the Year issue. And I was excited. I opened it up and I figured I'll just flip through. I'm not going to go to the end, to the table of contents. And I flipped through and I didn't see it. So then I went back again. Then I went back a third time going from the back forward and I didn't see it. And then I thought, well, it's not in here. And then I went to the table of contents and I read, and there in the bottom it said Russ Baker, and I went and looked at it. This thing was the smallest, narrowest column you've ever seen in your life. Is this working still? Seems like it went out, right? Okay. I'm not going to say anything about that, but all right. So it was the narrowest thing you ever saw. I mean, there was like room for like 2 words or 3 words per line. And the guy had told me he was one of the most interesting books he ever read, and he was so impressed. And when it came out, and then it said, it was very short, it was kind of non-committal, and it made a little jab at me. And then it said, they had introduced a new thing, which I don't know if they've done it since, and it was recommending where you should read a book, and it said, read it, skim it, toss it. Can you believe this? And mine at least didn't say toss, it said skim. Now look at that thing. Does that look like something you ought to skim? All right. So the guy was apologetic and he couldn't really say anything because he obviously had a fight with his superiors. I was invited initially from Meet the Press, NPR, PBS, on and on and on. They were saying, Jon Stewart, this and that and this and that. And they all were interested at every place. They all were riveted by this because of course they were. And how many of these things do you think I ended up on? 0. And finally, somebody had a connection at C-SPAN, and they said, you're giving a talk at a bookstore in Austin, we're going to come, like this fine young lady, and they came and they filmed. And I said to them, this will never see the light of day. And they it was funny, after my talk, there were 3 people in the crew, they were all there, had bought copies of my book to sign, and one of them said, we've done hundreds of these, and we have never, ever bought the book before. They all bought the book, I signed it. Anyway, I said to C-SPAN, when is this going to run? They said, oh, probably this weekend. So the weekend came, and the weekend went. And then the second week, because they only did the book stuff on weekends, maybe they still do. The third week, and then I called my agent. I said, "What's going on here?" He said, "Oh, no, I have this friend there. He says it's going to run. They're just backed up." I said, "They're not backed. I don't know." And then the fourth week, and then the fifth week, and then the sixth week. And I swear, and I was thinking, this is, okay, now I'm going to make a stink about this. And I think it was the seventh week. Don't hold me to this. And I went and I took the TV listings, and I went through from Friday to Monday, because it ends on Monday. And I went through Friday, and I went through every single one not there. Saturday, every single one not there. Sunday, every single one there. Now I'm over midnight. I'm over midnight into Monday. Midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 a.m. 4 a.m. And they told me they always run it at least 3 or 4 times. They ran it at 4 a.m. and never again. Okay? Just telling you. So anyway, listen, we got to be fair to everybody here. Maybe you have some comments or some questions. I just want to say I started an organization called WhoWhatWhy. John, do you have that thing? Did you pass that around? We have a sign-up sheet if you would like to be monitored by the CIA and the FBI, and also perhaps be on our mailing list to see the stories we're doing. We're small. We're a non-profit. We don't accept any advertising. We're very proud of that. We got a great crew of people who have all the right credentials. One of our editors was at the New Yorker for 30 years. We've got 2 people from the Wall Street Journal. So all the things you want that make you trust stuff, they're all there. We're very proud. Our board includes John Larson and some other very esteemed folks we're very, very proud of. And we're doing what we can. We're small. We love it. If anybody has come into money and they want to support what we do, please do sign up. We cover issues we think are important, like climate change, the plague of gun violence in America, the voting systems in America, the problem with voter suppression. Most of these elections the last few years have been incredibly close, less than 1% difference. Frankly, Trump would not have been president if a few more people in a few states who wanted to vote had been allowed to vote. And this is a big issue. We cover that as well. That's really it. I would just say the press is attacked as the enemy of the people because it can expose and challenge and challenge us and force us to question our most cherished beliefs and often myths. But extraordinary times call for outside the lines journalism, and that is what we're trying to do. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions. Yes, ma'am, right there.
What story is it going to take to bring Trump down?
What story is it going to take to bring Trump down, she asks. Well, you see, this is interesting because he's almost what's the right word? I don't want to say bulletproof, but you know what I mean. That's one thing he probably isn't, but he, it's just that I talk to people who support him, and even if they say they know that he's a liar and a scoundrel, whatever, they don't care. And this is because he says things that they're angry about. And this gets into that cultural thing I was talking about. They feel that their way of life, the fabric of life, is threatened. They think that people are trying to take their money away, their jobs away, and so on. And he addresses that, and they will overlook anything. And so I have to tell you, when I was writing about George W. Bush, I was hired by Harper's Magazine, you may know Harper's, and they assigned me to do a piece, and I was going out finding out that he had dodged the military during Vietnam. Would you think it would be a big deal when he was sending the U.S. into an unnecessary war in Iraq? And they said it's not big enough. I said, well, what do you need? They said, well, with him, he basically would have had to have killed somebody. So I think this is the problem. What is that story? I think everybody's racking their brains saying we should do our job and get the perspective right on this fellow, but how do you do that? I don't know the answer. Yes, ma'am.
3 things. You talked about maintaining the status quo, and you talked about power and maintaining it. You talked about truth and honesty, and the question is how do you gain access to the information, like the objective data, to make decisions? I think we're losing critical analysis ability. I pointed out very truly that there's not enough time, and people just want the summary of the instant. In my own life, I wrote a report, and my own boss on her cell phone said it's too long, and yet I had to have the data there to support my argument.
Right. So,
One last point I remember someone, Norman McClure, years ago, that talked about meaning is the message. So are we so shaped by our objects, our phones, that
So the problem here is that she said something so beautiful that you couldn't hear, was full of different points, all of which are super interesting. I'll just address one is, are we losing the ability to do critical analysis? To some extent, yes, and can we get the actual data? Good investigative journalists, that's what we do, we get data. You know, even data could probably be faked, but we go and we try to obtain through the Freedom of Information Act and so on, we try to obtain government data. And we use that. And if you read my book, almost everything in there are documents from George Bush. You know, it's not from me, it's all actual stuff that I don't think is challenged. That's the job of journalism, to find those very difficult pieces of evidence and then to do a great analysis of it.
But even journalism is cutting back.
I got you, I just put it, yeah. Who else wants that? Yes, sir.
Would you comment on the cutback of investigative journalists at the Times, at the Washington Post, at, you know, papers that any of us rely on?
So the question is about, can I comment on the cutbacks in investigative journalism at the New York Times, Washington Post, and so on? This is a huge problem. This is one of the reasons that I'm hoping we grow WhoWhatWhy to be. We're not where we are yet because we don't have the resources. Investigative reporting is very expensive. It's the first thing they cut. Very expensive, very time consuming, requires a very advanced skill set. And most journalists are not investigative reporters. You read your local papers. I mean, it's, you know, they went to the town meeting and this person said this. It's very difficult to do, and I think we are losing it. We're hoping at WhoWhatWhy we have a thing we call the Mentor Apprentice Program. We're trying to find funding for it to train a new generation of investigative journalists and pair them with people like John, you know, mentors who can really teach them how to do it. We could maybe take 2 or 3 more questions. Yes, ma'am.
I want to make one comment. Recently, the Washington Post, New York Times, and a few other newspapers, including PBS, on their site, have a little message at the very bottom. If you have any information to give to us, we would be happy to have it anonymously.
Right. Yeah, they're all asking everybody if you can leak stuff to them, you can send stuff to them. You know what, in the dirty little secret in journalism was they never really knew anything. You know, the New York Times won Pulitzer Prizes, not saying they didn't do good work, but it wasn't like they were geniuses. If you had something, you gave it to the New York Times. And it was this cycle, and so they won the Pulitzers because they had it, and then everybody wanted to work there and everybody wanted to read it. That's how it works. So I think at some point, because of competition and the internet, everybody was like, forget it, let's just basically tell everybody we need your stuff, and that's what we're all doing. Yes, ma'am.
How do we, as educated consumers, I'm making a leap here, but I'm making that assumption, have the tools to assess what we're reading?
How do we as educated consumers have the tools to assess what we're reading? Well, this is very difficult. People always ask me, what do you read and what do you trust? I generally have to say I don't read most of the prestige publications or watch those shows because everybody's always telling me about them. Because everybody only gets those 3 or 4. So I always hear, here's what she said, here's what he said, here's what they wrote. And it's not that it's not great stuff, it's particularly aesthetically pleasing. Certainly NPR has a beautiful sound, which is a big part of their brand. It sounds great. And even you're driving, you're making your coffee, it's just aesthetically, and they're actually experts. And believe it or not, this is a major part of their secret sauce, is the aesthetics of it. The New Yorker, the writing is beautiful, the observations are beautiful, it has a poetry to it. Whether it's exactly the full story, may or may not be, but it makes you feel that it's something valuable. So I think that to some extent, I try to read like little known sources. I actually look for things that other people don't know about. And frankly, like my book, which is, by the way, despite my being blacklisted from everything, it's a national bestseller. It's sold, I'm guessing 150,000 copies or something, which is a lot for a book. It's in its, I don't know how manyth printing, and it's an audio book by the same guy who did the voice for Thomas Friedman's book, and I still get invited, it's still selling. So, you know, people are interested. Interestingly enough, I find that the elite, those who in general go to like Ivy League schools, live in the swanky parts of Vermont, in Manhattan, you know, in Malibu and so on, they know the least about what's going on. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but the people who know are this odd woman who works on the railroad in, you know, so-and-so Iowa or whatever, and they just have a lot of free time somehow, and they're sitting there reading these books they pick up. It's, you know, like over here at the second hand, you know, the one you never heard of. It doesn't have the blurbs from Thomas Friedman on the back. That's the stuff they're reading. So I would just say go against the crowd a little bit and look for unusual perspectives. Yes, sir.
Well, I would contend that back at the time of Vietnam, Vietnam was protested so strongly by the public, and we were being lied to by McNamara and Johnson and many others. And the public got a hold of that and started protesting and brought change to our government and to our country. And I feel that today we need that kind of protest from the public. It needs to come up from the public to get out in the streets and start protesting what's going on with our government today. I'm very discouraged that that will ever happen, at least in the short term, because the economy's good.
Yeah.
You hear that?
Yeah.
The economy, stock market's up.
Yeah.
The people at Dartmouth and all of these elite schools, that's one of the most important things for most of them. So how are we going to change what's happening now?
Could you hear what he said? He was saying that in the old days, protest made a difference, and now it seems like it won't, because people, a lot of people who are doing well economically, they don't want to say anything. Well, Puerto Rico, yeah. Obviously, some cases it can have an impact. I think one of the problems is whether the media covers it or not. And the media covered the Puerto Rican. Somehow they like the optics of that. You can ask why. But they don't cover a lot of protest. I mean, at WhoWhatWhy, we're trying to cover the climate change movement. Do you know there's protests everywhere trying to block bridges and stuff, and the media's not covering it? And the reason is, it's not that the media's bad, it's not inherently that interesting a story. It doesn't have any conflict. It's just people went out in the streets and did this. It seems to be just a few sentences, maybe a picture. They want pictures of people with colored hair and crazy, you know, colorful. So these are real problems, but we are trying to address this, at least our organization is, to figure out how to let people know that there are people out there trying to do something.
In addition, in 2020, do you think if Trump gets a second term, it may be the downfall of our future?
The question was, in 2020, do I think Trump gets a second term? I'm going to make this the last question because I know they've got to stop filming, I think, so.
The question was, will it be our downfall?
And will he get a second term? And will it be our downfall?
Yes.
Okay. Look, you know, I never predict anything, although I believe I predicted that he would win in 2016. I think there's a very high probability he will win again. I think this country's in really, really deep trouble. I don't think that the major institutions, whether it's Congress or the media or academia, are rising to the occasion. I think they're way too slow. Sorry? Or the Supreme Court. Well, that one has been stacked for years against, you know. Yeah. All right, I don't know, was there anybody else who's dying to ask a question or otherwise? Okay, well, let's meet downstairs. I'm happy to sign copies of the book. Thank you very much, really enjoyed it.